It was the spring of 1998 when 24-year-old Nora Fields first smelled the change on the wind. It wasn't the familiar scent of Oregon rain on dry soil or the sweet perfume of apple blossoms from the neglected orchard. This was a new smell, a strange, malty, almost sour aroma that clung to the damp air. It was the smell of industry, and it had no business being on the quiet, forgotten lane that led to her family's struggling farm. She stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands, and watched as the first truck, a hulking, silver tanker truck with the logo of a regional brewery emblazoned on its side, rumbled past her property line. It didn't stop at her gate. It continued on, down a dirt access road that bordered the northernmost pasture, a parcel of land that was technically owned by the county but had been functionally abandoned for decades. The truck backed up to the edge of the field, its reverse alarm a shrill scream in the morning stillness. Then, with a great hydraulic hiss, it tilted its massive container. A thick, steaming, oatmeal-like sludge poured onto the ground, forming a great, pale mountain that slumped and spread across the green grass. The truck righted itself, its duty done, and drove away, leaving behind the first deposit. 90 tons of spent grain, warm, wet, and reeking of fermented barley. They had dumped it, without permission, without a word, right behind her farm. Let me tell you, the whispers started almost immediately. The community, what was left of it in that hollowed-out agricultural valley, saw the pile of brewery waste as the final insult. Nora Fields had just buried her father 2 months prior, inheriting a farm that was already drowning. The land was tired, the equipment was ancient, and the debt was a storm cloud that never moved on. Her father, a man of quiet conviction, had refused to follow the path of his neighbors, refusing to mortgage his future for bigger machines and chemical fertilizers. He had worked the land his way, a slower, more deliberate way, and in the end, the modern world had simply outpaced him. Now Nora, with a biology degree that seemed utterly useless in the face of foreclosure notices, was all that was left. The neighbors, leaning on their fences and talking in hushed tones at the general store, saw only 2 paths for her. She could fight the brewery, a hopeless and expensive legal battle she couldn't possibly win, or she could fold, sell the last few acres for pennies on the dollar, and be done with it. They saw the mountain of grain as a tombstone, marking the death of the Fields family farm. He was right, in a way, the old farmer down the road who told her to just give up. He stood by her fence, his face a roadmap of worry and sun damage. "Nora, child," he had said, his voice raspy with genuine pity. "There's no shame in it. Your pa was a good man, but he was a stubborn one. This world doesn't have room for his kind of farming anymore. That pile of mess back there, that's the world telling you it's over. Call the realtor. Don't let pride sink you." The men at the farm supply co-op were less kind. Their pity was laced with condescension. They saw a young woman, alone, with soft hands and a college education, trying to hold onto a ghost. They saw the dumped grain not as an insult, but as a fittingly pathetic end to a story of decline. Their laughter was quiet, but it was there, a low chuckle that said they knew exactly how this story was going to end. But they were wrong. The men gathered in that dusty co-op, trading machinery and conventional wisdom since before she was a thought, believed they knew exactly what they were seeing. They saw a nuisance, a biohazard, a legal liability. They saw 90 tons of garbage. Nora Fields saw something else entirely. She saw 90 tons of possibility. Now, let me explain something about Nora's father, Thomas Fields. He was not just a farmer. In his heart, he was a scholar of the soil. He had never gone to college, but his personal library contained more books on soil science, mycology, and botany than the local high school. His greatest treasures were not deeds or titles, but a set of 12 leather-bound journals, one for each month of the year, filled with decades of meticulous records. He had documented rainfall, soil temperature, pH levels, crop rotations, and the subtle shifts in the land's character with the precision of a laboratory scientist. As a child, Nora had spent countless hours by his side, not pushing a plow, but learning to see. He taught her how to crumble soil between her fingers and diagnose its health by texture and smell. "The soil is alive, Nora," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "It remembers everything. It remembers kindness, and it remembers abuse. Most folks these days, they just shout at it with chemicals. They've forgotten how to listen." His core philosophy was simple and, in the eyes of his contemporaries, hopelessly outdated. He believed the farm should be a closed loop. That waste was not waste, but merely a resource in the wrong place. He composted everything. He cultivated cover crops to fix nitrogen in the soil, letting fields lie fallow not in failure, but in careful, deliberate rest. The land, he taught her, was not a factory for producing commodities, but a partner in a complex dance of creation. And in one of those journals, in the section for March, nestled between notes on early planting and frost dates, was a page that Nora remembered vividly. It was a detailed entry from 1978 about an experiment he had conducted, amending a patch of poor clay soil with spent grain he had gotten from a small, local brew pub that had long since closed down. He had written, "The mycelial growth is extraordinary. The grain, rich in protein and sugars, acts as a perfect fuel for the fungi. They are the great digesters, the secret engines of the soil. They turn this waste into black gold." That night, after the first truck had come and gone, Nora didn't call a lawyer. She didn't cry. She went into her father's dusty office, the air still smelling faintly of his pipe tobacco and old paper, and pulled the March journal from the shelf. She ran her fingers over his familiar, looping script. Then she walked to her own bookshelf and pulled down a thick university textbook, An Introduction to Mycology. She sat at the old oak desk, the journal open on one side, the textbook on the other, a single lamp casting a pool of golden light in the darkness. The brewery had dumped 90 tons of warm, wet, protein-rich, pre-sterilized organic material on her doorstep. They had, without knowing it, delivered the single most expensive and difficult-to-source component for large-scale mushroom cultivation. For free. A slow smile spread across her face. The men at the co-op saw a tombstone. Her father had taught her to see a foundation. "Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Have you ever had a moment of clarity so profound, so absolute, that the laughter and doubt of the entire world sounded like nothing more than distant static?" That was Nora Fields in that moment. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, what she had to do. The plan that formed in her mind that night was not a desperate gamble. It was a logical conclusion, a synthesis of her father's ancestral wisdom and her own modern education. The world had handed her a problem. She was going to turn it into a harvest. The next morning, she did not walk toward the pile of grain with a shovel. She walked to the old, long-abandoned potato shed at the back of the property. It was a dark, cavernous structure, its wooden walls silvered with age. The air inside was thick with the ghost smell of damp earth and forgotten harvests. For decades, it had been a tomb for broken equipment and rusted tools. Nora saw it not as a relic of the past, but as the perfect incubator for her future. It was insulated. It was dark. It had a concrete floor. Over the next week, as more brewery trucks arrived, adding to the steaming mountain behind her farm, Nora worked. She cleared out the junk. She scrubbed the floors and walls with bleach until her hands were raw. She patched the holes in the roof and sealed the cracks in the walls, creating a contained, controllable environment. She used salvaged lumber from a collapsed barn to build rows of simple, sturdy shelves. She was not fighting the brewery's mess. She was preparing a home for it. Her first major obstacle was acquiring the seed. She needed mushroom spawn, and she needed it in bulk. She drove the old farm truck into town, to the very same farm supply co-op where the men had pitied her. She walked up to the main counter, where the owner, a portly man named Mr. Abernathy, was holding court. He represented the gatekeeper of conventional wisdom, a man who had built his business selling the seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides her father had so staunchly rejected. When Nora asked for 50 pounds of shiitake and oyster mushroom spawn, he stopped talking. The store went quiet. Abernathy leaned on the counter, a smirk playing on his lips. 50 pounds? What are you planning on doing with that, little lady? Growing a few for your kitchen? I need it for a commercial operation, Nora said, her voice steady. The smirk broke into a full-blown chuckle. The other men in the store shifted, grinning. A commercial operation? Abernathy boomed, playing to his audience. Of mushrooms? Here? What are you going to grow them on, daydreams? Spent grain, Nora replied, her gaze unwavering. The laughter that followed was not quiet this time. It was loud, open, and dismissive. Abernathy wiped a tear of mirth from his eye. Spent grain? That stinking pile of garbage the brewery is dumping on you? Child, that's not substrate, that's a health hazard. You'll grow nothing but mold and disappointment. Stick to potatoes, Nora. Your father, bless his heart, at least knew how to grow potatoes. This mushroom fantasy is going to sink you. He turned away, dismissing her completely. I can't in good conscience sell you that much spawn. You'd just be throwing your money away. He was right. She would have been throwing her money away, paying his inflated prices. That rejection, that public humiliation, was the single most important gift Mr. Abernathy could have given her. It forced her to be self-reliant. That night, she didn't despair. She got back to her books. She learned that she could cultivate her own spawn from a single store-bought mushroom. It was a slow, sterile, and unforgiving process, requiring the precision of a laboratory. She converted a small closet in the farmhouse into a clean room, using a pressure cooker for sterilization and petri dishes she ordered from a scientific supply company. It took weeks of painstaking work, of failures and contaminations, but eventually, she succeeded. In the cool, quiet dark of the closet, a delicate, white, web-like network of mycelium began to spread across a dish of agar. She had her seed, and it had cost her almost nothing. The subsequent 2 decades were a masterclass in patience and brutal, solitary work. Let me tell you, those first years were a kind of hell. The work was relentless. She had to move the grain from the ever-growing pile into the potato shed. She did it by hand, with a wheelbarrow and a shovel. Each load was heavy, wet, and steaming. Her back ached constantly. Her hands were a permanent landscape of blisters and calluses. She had to pack the grain into specialized plastic bags, sterilize them in a massive, custom-built steamer she'd constructed from an old water tank, and inoculate each one with her homegrown spawn. Failure was a constant companion. The first entire batch, hundreds of bags, was lost to a virulent green mold. The shed filled with the smell of decay, the smell of her own failure. The whispers from the community grew louder. We told her so, they'd say. Poor Thomas's girl has finally lost it. There was a night, deep in that second winter, when she nearly gave up. She sat on an overturned bucket in the middle of the dark, cold shed, surrounded by 1,000 plastic bags of inert, useless grain. The weight of the debt, the loneliness, the physical exhaustion, and the chorus of doubt pressed down on her. She thought of the farmer's advice to just sell. It seemed so easy, a quiet surrender. Then she thought of her father. She remembered his hands, calloused but gentle, holding up a clump of dark, rich earth. She remembered his voice. They've forgotten how to listen. She took a deep breath. The air didn't just smell of failure anymore. Underneath it, there was a faint, earthy promise. She wasn't shouting at the land. She was listening. She got up, picked up her notebook, and began to make adjustments. The first signs of success were so small, they were almost invisible. A tiny pinhead of a mushroom, a single shiitake, pushing its way out of a bag. Nora stared at it for a full minute, her heart pounding. It was perfect. Then, a few days later, a whole cluster appeared. Then another. Within a month, she harvested her first 10 pounds. She didn't sell them. She cooked them all and ate them herself, a quiet, solitary feast of defiance. The subsequent harvests grew exponentially. She refined her process, learning the precise balance of humidity, temperature, and airflow the mushrooms craved. The potato shed, once a tomb, was now alive. It breathed. The air within was thick with the rich, loamy scent of shiitakes and the delicate, anise-like perfume of oyster mushrooms. The land remembered. The grain, once a symbol of waste, had become the fertile soil of her salvation. She sold her first batches at a small farmer's market in a neighboring town, far from the judgment of her own community. People were hesitant at first, but the quality was undeniable. Her mushrooms were beautiful, flavorful, and incredibly fresh. Then, a local chef bought a pound on a whim. The next week, he came back and bought 10. He told her they were the best he had ever cooked with. Word began to spread through the tight-knit community of chefs. They were tired of produce shipped from thousands of miles away. They were hungry for something local, something authentic, something with a story. And Nora's mushrooms had the best story of all. The turning point, the moment the whisper of her success became a roar, came by pure chance. A well-known food writer from a major Portland newspaper was driving through the valley when his car broke down less than a quarter mile from her farm. While waiting for a tow truck, he wandered down the lane, drawn by a curious, earthy aroma. He saw the mountain of spent grain, still being replenished by the brewery's trucks. And he saw Nora, loading boxes of perfect, jewel-like mushrooms into her old farm truck. He was intrigued. He asked her questions. He stayed for 2 hours, scribbling in a notepad, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning wonder. The article came out 2 weeks later. The headline was, "The Accidental Harvest: How One Woman Turned a Brewery's Trash into Culinary Treasure." It was a sensation. The story was irresistible. The young, underestimated woman, the struggling family farm, the wisdom of her late father, the mountain of industrial waste transformed into gourmet gold. Her phone began to ring. It did not stop. Chefs from the finest restaurants in Portland, then Seattle, then San Francisco, all wanted her mushrooms. Distributors called, wanting exclusive contracts. The demand was overwhelming. She had to hire her first employee, then 2 more. She invested in a refrigerated truck. She converted the old hay barn into a state-of-the-art packing and shipping facility. The farm was no longer struggling. It was thriving. It was a business. A $600,000 a year business built from garbage. Then, in the fall of 2005, a sleek, expensive sedan crunched up her gravel driveway. A man in a crisp, logoed polo shirt and pressed slacks got out. He looked uncomfortable, out of place amidst the functional, unpretentious backdrop of the working farm. He introduced himself as the vice president of operations for the brewery. He was here, he said, to finally formalize the disposal arrangement. He walked with the easy confidence of a man used to holding all the cards, assuming he was dealing with a simple farmer grateful for a place to dump their waste. Nora did not meet him on the porch. She led him past the old farmhouse, past the now thriving vegetable gardens, and into the converted hay barn. The moment he stepped inside, his confidence wavered. He had expected dirt floors and cobwebs. Instead, he found a brightly lit, immaculately clean facility. The air was cool and smelled of ozone from the air filtration system. He saw 3 employees in hairnets and white coats, weighing and packing mushrooms into branded boxes. He saw pallets of those boxes, stacked high, shrink-wrapped and ready for shipment, with labels addressed to the most exclusive restaurants and distributors on the West Coast. He saw a forklift. He saw a business far more sophisticated than his own brewery's logistics. He turned to Nora, his expression a mixture of shock and confusion. The condescending ease was gone, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable respect. How did you do this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't asking about the mushrooms. He was asking about the entire reality-defying operation humming around him. Nora looked at him, her expression calm and unreadable. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stated the truth. "You gave me 90 tons of a problem," she said. "My father taught me that problems are just opportunities you haven't learned to listen to yet. You gave me the soil. He taught me how to plant the seed." She then led him to her office, which was no longer in the old farmhouse but in a clean, well-lit room overlooking the packing floor. On her desk, next to a vase of fresh flowers from her garden, was a single, leather-bound document. It was a contract. She slid it across the desk toward him. "This is the new disposal arrangement," she said. It was not a request. It was a declaration. The terms were simple. From now on, the brewery would not be dumping their waste. They would be delivering her primary raw material. They would pay her a per-ton fee for the service of taking it. They would adhere to a strict delivery schedule and ensure the grain met her quality specifications. If they didn't like the terms, they were free to find another place to dump the 90 tons of spent grain they produced every single week. The vice president stared at the contract, then back at Nora. He saw no room for negotiation in her eyes. The power dynamic had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The liability his company had created on her land had become her single greatest asset, and therefore their greatest vulnerability. He picked up the pen. He signed. A few weeks later, another visitor came to the farm. It was Mr. Abernathy from the co-op. He came not in his work truck, but in his Sunday car, and he held his hat in his hands as he stood on her porch. He didn't make eye contact at first. "Nora," he began, his voice thick with a humility she had never heard from him before. I was wrong. What you've done here, it's incredible. I've never seen anything like it." He finally looked up at her. "I came to ask if maybe I could be your supplier, for bags, for supplements. I'll give you the best price, better than whatever you're paying now. I'd be honored to have your business." Nora looked at the man who had laughed her out of his store, who had publicly declared her a fool. She could have savored the moment. She could have reminded him of his words. But her father had also taught her about grace. "I'll have my manager look over your catalog, Mr. Abernathy," she said simply. "Thank you for stopping by." It was an absolution he hadn't earned, but one she chose to give. The vindication was not in his apology, but in the undeniable reality of the thriving, living farm around them. "Now, let me take you forward another 15 years. The Fields farm is unrecognizable. The mountain of grain is gone, replaced by a series of massive, climate-controlled halls where the delivery, mixing, and bagging process is almost fully automated. The farm is not just a mushroom operation anymore. It's a center for regenerative agriculture. The spent substrate from the mushroom houses, now a dark, incredibly rich compost, is used to heal the once tired fields. The land that was on its deathbed now produces some of the most sought-after organic vegetables in the state. The soil, once pale and lifeless, is now dark and rich and fragrant. It is soil that feels like cake in your hands. It is alive. Nora Fields is no longer the underestimated outsider. She is a master of her craft, a respected elder in a new generation of farmers who look to her for guidance. She runs workshops, teaching young farmers how to listen to their land, how to see opportunity where others see waste. She is passing the torch. You can sometimes see her walking the fields with a young apprentice, a teenager from the town who reminds everyone of a young Nora. She carries one of her father's old journals, its pages now interleaved with her own notes, her own data, her own wisdom. She is adding her chapter to the family legacy. They said the farm was finished, that the pile of grain was its tombstone. But they were looking at the surface. They failed to see the life stirring underneath. They saw 90 tons of garbage, a liability to be fought or fled from. Nora saw 90 tons of fuel, an asset to be cultivated. The brewery thought they were dumping their waste behind her farm. In reality, they were delivering the foundation of her empire, piece by piece, truckload by truckload. The difference was never in the grain itself. The difference was in the knowledge to see what it could become, and the patience to wait for the harvest.